Good afternoon. I'm Deborah Quazzo, the co-founder of the ASU GSV Summit, and I want to welcome everyone to our live broadcast from here in the GSV offices in Chicago. And I also want to welcome you to the last 2 days of this extraordinary program at ASU GSV 2020 Virtual Summit. Today, I am so honored and proud to introduce our Truth and Reconciliation program, which will run through tomorrow. And I want to give a special shout out to my partner, Henry Hips from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who has been very much a partner as we've developed this program around critical topics of equity and race over the last few months and actually for the last few years. So thank you so much, Henry, for your inspiration. The program will kick off shortly with my fireside chat with former New Orleans Mayor Mitch Landrieu. This will be followed by sessions featuring Mitch's dear friend and mine as well, Arnie Duncan and Billy Moore of CRED, a powerful conversation with Carlos Watson, Jim Shelton, and Pam Cantor on protecting and elevating our Black children, a conversation with NBA All-Star Baron Davis and Taylor Neiman of Toucan, a dialogue between Uber Chief Legal Officer Tony West and Anarima Bhargava, both formerly of the Obama Justice Team, and then ending the day today with a provocative conversation with Malcolm Gladwell and my partner and GSV founder, Michael Moe. You are not going to want to miss any of this, I promise. Tomorrow is our final day. It's been 5 and roughly half days of incredible content around education, innovation, and giving all people equal access to the future. Tomorrow will be the final day and will include intense conversations with leaders from K-12 and higher education sectors, allowing for active audience participation, as there actually will be in our sessions shortly. Additionally, there will be master classes with Harvard Business School's Rosabeth Moss Cantor and others, as well as sessions with the leadership from Zoom and Microsoft on optimizing remote learning. In addition, the Truth and Reconciliation program will continue with an incredible lineup, including Pulitzer Prize winner and author of Caste, Isabel Wilkerson, and Eddie Glaude, Princeton African American Studies professor and author of Begin Again, the story of James Baldwin. Additional star power includes Jeff Maggiancalda, the CEO of Coursera, Martha Cantor, former Undersecretary of Education, Scott McNeely, co-founder of Sun Microsystems and founder of Curriki, Kaya Henderson, the former superintendent of DC Public Schools, Mark Brackett from Yale, and frankly, so much talent that it's truly impossible to name them all. That's all to say, it's can't miss program. And for those sessions you can't see, they will quickly be available on demand. So with that, sorry for that long drum roll, Mitch. It is my total pleasure to introduce Mitch Landrieu, former Louisiana Lieutenant Governor, former Mayor of New Orleans, and the New York Times best-selling author of In the Shadow of Statues, A White Southerner Confronts History. And again, please feel free to submit Q&A into the Q&A box, and I will try to get to any questions that we can. But we have a lot of topics to cover with Mitch. So Mitch, first, thank you so much for joining, and I'm so grateful to our common friend Arnie Duncan for making the connection. So I had a great time. I so enjoyed your book, and in reading it, discovered that you and I are exactly the same vintage. You turned 60 about a month before I do at the end of this year. We both come from a Southern upbringing. You, of course, from very, very deep roots in New Orleans, and me from Jacksonville, Florida, but with grandparents from Mississippi and West Virginia. I, like you, had a Wynton Marsalis moment when a dear Black friend, in my case, my good friend Jim Shelton, who I'm guessing is also a friend of yours, burst my naive bubble to make me realize the insanity of having public schools named after Confederate Civil War heroes. If you could just begin by talking about your dear friend Wynton Marsalis and how he challenged you and helped you see the issue of the Confederate statues in New Orleans in a totally different light.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's great to be with you, and I do want to thank my friend Arnie Duncan, who's such a great American patriot and wonderful friend, for putting us together. Just a couple of things to say about framing this issue up. The Confederate monuments basically are symptomatic and symbolic of institutional bias and race that is woven throughout the institutions of America that we walk by every day and don't notice. There's a whole sub-story about them, but generally speaking, to respond to the incredible outline of speakers that you have coming, every one of them spectacular. Isabel Wilkerson is one of the great Americans' minds, as is Professor Eddie Glaude, who are going to just rock your world and open your mind to some things that perhaps we haven't thought about. But essentially, let me begin here by framing the issue for your Truth and Reconciliation series. Slavery is America's original sin. We've heard that time and time again. Racism continues to this day to be this nation's Achilles heel. There's no question that everywhere we go in America, no matter if it's a small town in the South or a larger city in the North, whether it's rural or urban, people are very proud of the places that they come from, irrespective of what conditions they grew up in. Every person that I know loves this country in a very, very special and important way. It is not antithetical, though. It is actually very patriotic to follow the requirements of our founding fathers, to follow the idea of America, and to begin to question and to continue to improve on America when we have gotten things wrong. And one of the things that we have gotten wrong in this country, one of the things that we have never confronted, is the issue of race. We never have really, as a country, much like in Isabel Wilkerson, we'll talk about this, India or Germany or South Africa actually have acknowledged, have owned up to, have apologized appropriately for, and recommitted ourselves to a better way, which is essentially to be more fully American than we ever have been. The most American idea that exists, it is the reason why this country is here, is because we are based on an idea. We're not based on a heritage. We're not based on handing something down from generation to generation. The idea is fairly simple, is that everybody comes to the table of democracy as equals. And I think that we have to admit, no matter how patriotic each of us considers ourselves to be, that we have fallen short. And there are lots of examples of why that's so. So essentially what happened to me, even though I have lived in a family that has been part of the civil rights struggle for a long time, from the moment that I was born and for all the years that I've served, was that as we were rebuilding the city of New Orleans after having really been decimated from Katrina, where 1,800 people were killed across the Gulf Coast, 500,000 homes were hurt, 250,000 were destroyed. We were physically rebuilding the city. And we were in the midst of rebuilding airports, schools, riverfronts, public health clinics, et cetera, et cetera. I was having a conversation with my friend, Wynton Marsalis, who I kind of grew up with. I mean, the world knows him as the greatest musician and a great trumpet player, but we kind of knew each other and had kind of grown up. And he was in town having done a concert the night before at an iconic theater that we have here that we rebuilt after Katrina called the Sanger. And we were chit-chatting about the 300th anniversary of New Orleans, which at that moment was 4 years away from us. And I was thinking about how to curate it to get the people of New Orleans really focused on building back the city, not the way it was, but the way it should have been had we gotten it right the first time. And Wynton just very off the cuff said to me, well, hey, man, if you're going to do that, you need to take the Confederate monuments down. Now, I walk by those monuments every day of my life, and it actually never occurred to me. And I said, well, why would I do that? And he said, well, this is what he said to me. He said, have you ever thought about it from my perspective? Have you ever looked at it from where I stand and where I sit? And, when he said that, I thought to myself, no, I have never done that. And he said further, do you know why they're there? Do you know who put them up? Do you know what the intended purpose is? And do you know people like Louis Armstrong left because of things like that? Now, Isabel Wilkerson wrote a book called The Warmth of Other Suns that actually talks about how many people left the South because they felt unwelcome and uncomfortable. And when he said that to me, my brain just kind of exploded, because he was telling me something that I knew, but I never thought deeply enough about to actually completely change the way I saw how public spaces are critically important to the truth of whether or not we actually treated everybody equal. And of course, in my research, I found out about the lost cause. I found out that those monuments were put up well after the Civil War ended. They were part of political propaganda to basically transform the narrative of the Civil War. And the narrative that the lost cause told was that wasn't it a shame that the South lost the war? something terrible was lost and the country's worse off because of it. Well, of course, that's upside down. The historical truth is that the Civil War was fought to destroy the country, and it was fought for the cause of preserving slavery, which is as anti-American as you can get. And so that kind of started a journey into saying that these things are not just stone and metal, but they represent an idea that is uniquely un-American, uniquely not patriotic, and that we need to really start to do a deeper dive in this country if we're ever going to get to a point of reconciliation. And that's what started at least that very small chapter in my life, which resulted in, amongst other things, and with the work of lots of people, those 4 monuments coming down in the country.
A remarkable story. You actually, talked about the erection of the statues, really as you said, decades after the Civil War, as historical malfeasance. And you also said that a great nation doesn't hide its history. We are, at ASU GSV, we're an Education Innovation Summit, really all about the transformation of pre-K to grade education. And this is actually our first ever Truth and Reconciliation Day. So as a mayor who's also controlled an education system, a big, and we'll get into that story later. How do you think about education in America and how it should be transformed, and frankly in the world, to speak truth and tell the whole American narrative? How do you think we hit reset on that entire topic?
Right. Well, you said there were a lot of things that were in that question. So let me address the first strong accusation that I made. When I really got into the history of how these monuments got put up and who was fighting taking them down, they were, I guess, self-described historical societies whose self-professed job was to protect our history. And of course, the accusation was that I and other people who wanted to take the monuments down were erasing history. What was so interesting about that is the plethora and the sheer number of Confederate monuments that are up in America that are on public spaces of political power. That is a very unique thing, A. And B, most of those monuments, if not all of them, were men. And almost all of those monuments are, by definition, monuments to remember 4 years of our history, 1861 to 1865. Of course, the country is exponentially older and has a lot more years in it than 4 years. And so I told these folks who were holding on selfishly to these public spaces, if your mission was to remember our nation's history, then you're responsible for historic malfeasance. If not the least of which is because you completely ignored every year except for 4 years. And so if you were going to tell the whole history of our country on limited public space, don't you think that you would tell the whole history? And by the way, the history that you did tell, you only told from one perspective, and that perspective happened to be historically wrong. So that's why I spoke to that, because the people who get to write the history are the people who get to prepare for the future. And if you control the narrative, and if you control the history, if you control what people read and write and what they hear, then you basically control where people are going into the future. And so when I was talking to people who were opposed to taking the monuments down, who just were kind of vanilla about it, they were like, well, I don't know if they should come down. And I asked them why they thought they should stay up. And I explained the history that I knew. And they all said to me, my mother particularly, 88-year-old woman who is a saint. She had 9 kids in 11 years. She's going straight to heaven. If she doesn't make it there, nobody's going to get there. But even my mother said to me, I didn't know anything about that. They never taught us about the Civil War. We don't know our history. So, I was always struck by this because I'm a lawyer. And when we swear witnesses in, we ask somebody to raise their hand. We ask them to put their hand on the Bible. And this is the colloquy. Do you swear? Do you swear to tell the truth? It doesn't stop there. They say the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Now, that's not just because the person who wrote that oath likes alliteration and they're poetic. The reason they say that, the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, is because you can lie by omitting. You can tell half of the truth and it not be the whole truth. You can tell some of the truth and not all of it. You cannot say anything. And if you don't have a complete picture of who you are, and you're not willing to look at both the good and bad parts of what it is that you have done, then how can you possibly self-correct? And so it's critically important, whether we're talking about healthcare, education, technology, the government, that we actually deal with those things in our nation's history that have stopped us from being the more perfect union and a democracy where everybody comes to the table as equals. If we have not done that in our past, there's nothing weak about recognizing that we have not lived up to that which we promised to each other. And so the nation will be stronger. We will be better. It is inconceivable to me that people in America cannot fully comprehend how much we have lost by not treating our fellow Americans as equal and how much we have to gain. This is actually the exciting part of it, why it's so incredibly hopeful and something that we should rush towards rather than fight against. How incredibly hopeful and joyful the United States of America is going to be when we actually start acting the way that we promised each other back in the day. And so to me, this is not about talking about who's at fault. I don't know that I can, if it was left to me or if it was my responsibility and it's not mine alone, to talk about that, whether or not you could actually get an answer to it. But I do know the answer to this question: whose responsibility it is to fix it. So it really isn't about fault. It really is about now going forward. And so then who is supposed to, and how do we, and what institutions are involved in changing how we learn? And that would be schools. And it's not just about what's in the textbooks. It's about what teachers know. It's about the subject matters that we talk about. It's about how we engage with each other. It also is about how school districts are created, how are they funded, how do they act in and of themselves, whether kids are actually learning, and then what they're learning. You saw anecdotally, the President of the United States, which is amazing to me, actually issued some kind of declaration, which I'm sure has no efficacy, but maybe it does, where he's going to talk about not being able to talk about the history that's been elucidated in the 1619 Project. In other words, we don't want to look back. We don't want to know where our warts are. That's all a terrible mistake. Burning the books is not a good way to get us into the future. And so academia, whether it's, whether it's primary and secondary, whether it's college, whether it's post, all of those institutions have a massive role to play just in the curricula. And then on top of that, how universities are organized and whether or not they're open to helping the country learn a new way is, I think, critically important as we go forward.
I happen to be a Princeton alum and was, discouraged by the move there by it was the Department of Education against the president of Princeton, and who was really trying to tell the truth and make amends related to past inequities at the university, and I think that goes along with what you said about other efforts to not let us talk about what's happened in our history in a candid and honest way.
Yeah, well, just in terms of narrative, if we talk about slavery, we don't talk about the enslaved. We talk about it like it's some other dimensional thing. If you start talking about it as a forced labor camp, where people were raped and beaten and the skin strewn off their backs, and mothers and fathers were separated from their children, it sounds a little different. If you talk about it as being benign slave masters as opposed to people that were occupying other people's lives, it's a very different thing. Number one. Number two, if you don't really think about, after slavery ended, the consequence of it and the sequela and the impact that it's had today, and white Americans particularly, who have a very difficult time addressing the issue because it's sensitive and we don't really know how to do it because we haven't practiced it and we haven't quite been willing to do it. We've fought about it. We've gone a couple of years where we had some progress, then we clap back, progress, clap back, progress, clap back. We're in a clap back moment right now. I never in my life thought, I'm from the South, even though you're from Florida, I consider Florida to be part of the South. So, and Texas too, even though I'm sorry, I don't like it, but you are. We've had characters that like Bull Connor and Leander Perez in Louisiana, but it's never it's never been in the mouth of the president of the United States. That's a whole different thing. I mean, really so offensive that it's not defensible for the president of the United States not to, in very clear language, denounce white supremacy. If there was ever an anti-American idea, white supremacy is it. And I think, you know, we have a lot of room in this country to argue about what the right approach to living is: conservative, moderate, liberal, progressive, whatever you know, flavor of the day is. But one thing that is not acceptable in America, in a democracy based on our Constitution, is an idea that some of us are superior to others because of the color of our skin. Racism is a social construct, and it has been for a long period of time. On top of that, I will say this to people, and I'm certainly not trying to offend anybody, but I don't want to let us walk away from this without confronting this truth. You know, when you talk to your friends who are people of color, if you're listening, they say, we're exhausted from why do we have to talk about this all the time? This is a white person's problem. And white people immediately go, wait, why is it my problem? Here's the answer. Besides the fact that we're the ones that impose it on other people, it's the person's responsibility who is in power to change it, because that's the only place where it can be changed. And if you say to yourself, well, wow, I never really thought about myself as white, you say, well, you know, welcome to the club. Black people are made to wear their blackness every day. And white people say, well, how do I do that? And I say, well, you really ought to think about it. But by the way, in terms of whose responsibility is, if you think about who owns the power in this country in a real and material and concrete way, you need do nothing more than ask yourself, well, who is in power and what other positions of power? And if you think about the presidency, the United States Senate, Congress, the Supreme Court, governorships, state legislatures, police departments, heads of universities, what you're going to find is that the overwhelming majority of people that are in charge of those institutions thoroughly through and through are predominantly white and mostly men. So if you were a person of color, and in this instance a woman, and somebody asks yourself, do you feel like you're in power? The obvious answer is, I don't feel like it because I'm not. And so if it is people who are in positions of power, responsibility to change something, it naturally falls to the people who hold those positions to do something about it. Who else would do it? And so this is something that we in white America have to deal with and confront. Now, we get afraid of it because we don't want to look, number one, at what some folks that we know might have did. And secondly, we don't know what the future holds. So we get nervous and afraid. But here's, you know, the absolute and essential truth. It's going to be okay. That diversity is a strength, not a weakness. We're all going to do better when everybody's got a shot. We're all going to benefit. And we have lost untold amounts of time, human joy and happiness, resource, economic output, scientific discovery. We have hurt ourselves tremendously, and we have not positioned ourselves well as we nearly should be to actually be where we have said we want to be. We've lost the first 2 decades of the 21st century when that never should have happened. We are now in a cataclysmically bad moment for not only our country and our world, and we have to decide to do something different. And this has to be a part of it, or we will never get to where we say as Americans we want to go.
Terrific points. I think one quick question, and maybe it's taken the pandemic, maybe it's taken the horrific developments around George Floyd and others, Breonna Taylor, et cetera. But it is remarkable to me. I mean, you made your, compelling and absolutely groundbreaking statue speech really in May of 2017. And yet it really took 3 more years to have us come to grips as a country. And I guess I have a couple of questions. I mean, how do you kind of reflect on that? I mean, why did it take us, that delay to really get the movement moving? And then, is there some, unique fabric? And I appreciate that there was nothing easy about your success in getting the statues taken down. Everything about it was hard, but it did happen. And it happened in New Orleans over 3 years ago. And it's taken the rest of the country and the world, of course, until 2020. You want to comment on that from a historic perspective, and if it gives you hope, as we think forward?
Yeah, a little bit. Yes, I will comment on it, but I want to give it a broader lens, if you will. Um, we've been fighting for 100 years or more for this, and what in the world has taken so long? You hear so many of the young Americans who are patriots that are protesting on the streets, reminding us of what Dr. King said in a moment of anxiety and exasperation, that asking us to be patient, telling us to wait. Wait almost always means never. The bigger question is, what the heck? Why are we even fighting about the Confederate monuments? I mean, what is even the argument, if you really think about it, for having a statue up of in a public space that's funded by the taxpayers, giving reverence to an individual who fought to destroy the country for the cause of preserving slavery? I, I can't really even get my brain around what the heck they went up for in the first place, much less why people are fighting about taking them down or changing the names of Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine, and Coast Guard bases. Can you imagine asking a young person who has dedicated their lives to the service of this country and is offering to give up the full measure of devotion, being willing to die for our country, to actually walk through a gate with the name of a person who would have kept them as a slave? That to me is just not worth. I can't believe we're fighting about it. And so I think people are genuinely frustrated. There are still 1,000 of these monuments up across the country. There are more markers. This issue has to be dealt with forthright. But listen, this is just the beginning. Again, if you just take these monuments down, if you just remove the names and change the names, but you don't change the attitude about why they went up in the first place or why people are fighting so hard to keep them up, then you are ignoring that in our country, we are still suffering from a difficulty with dealing with the past and recommitting ourselves to the true purpose of America. That's where the real work has to be done. And of course, if you are of the mind where you live in denial and you want to deny that African Americans and people of color are still on the short end of the stick no matter what, then Katrina should demonstrate that that has happened. If that's not enough for you and you don't want to go back to Emmett Till or the bombing in Birmingham or the murders in AME, then you can just talk about COVID. If you don't want to talk about COVID, you could talk about the economic impact of the crisis. Every which way you cut it, no matter where you look, people of color in this country end up on the short end of the stick, no matter what happens in good time and in bad. And it's not just unjust and unfair and un-American. It's also counterproductive for us as a country when we say we're the greatest country in the world. And by the way, we're faster and better than everybody else. And we do things better and smarter than everybody else. And hey, look at us, aren't we great? I think there are many people who basically say, listen, when you talk about America being great, again, when exactly were you talking about? And again, like Wenton said to me, have you thought about that from my perspective? And so I just strongly believe, and I respectfully suggest to my fellow Americans, we got a real problem that we've never dealt with. It's an open sore, and it continues to wound us, and we continue to respond badly to it because we have never thought about what it's going to take to heal. And unless we're able to, in a fully open and honest way, address those issues, we're all going to be worse off. And so it's much, much bigger than just the monuments. They're just symbols. We've got to get past the symbolism and get into the much deeper problems that we confront. And finally, this has manifested itself if people don't want to look at COVID, don't want to look at the economic crisis, don't want to look at Katrina. When you begin to look at the criminal justice system, and just this year in our lives with George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, you could go all the way back to Emmett Till. People could charge us with just being intentionally and purposefully blind and not wanting to see what is so obviously in front of us. And then they conclude that we actually just don't want to deal with it. And then you have alienation. And you get to the point of understanding more clearly what it means when you say, where there is no peace, where there is no justice, there can be no peace, because the lack of justice produces alienation. And we cannot be at peace as a country. A nation divided against itself cannot stand unless we deal with the essential defects and problems that have been plaguing us for such a long period of time.
Great. Well, and amen to that. So what I'd like to take it a little bit into one of those sort of tremendous issues, and the issue that this ASU GSV Summit really is all about, Mitch, which is all people, capital A, capital L, capital L, having equal access to the future through a world-class education. And obviously, New Orleans, through the horrific impact of Katrina, and you've already cited in the 1,800 deaths, the 125 billion in damage, the untold effect on the city. But it did force New Orleans to rethink its education system, because this education system had been effectively wiped out. I know this isn't a simple story, but if you would mind, talking about the key drivers, where the city sits today, the progress that's been made, the importance or impact of school choice in that, the charter school system that was built, and what needs to happen next in New Orleans to take it to the next level, of the phases of getting to a place where all people have equal access to the future.
Yeah, well, a couple things. First of all, New Orleans did go through a fairly transformational moment with K through 12. New Orleans, the New Orleans School District, to be distinguished from the districts that are in and around New Orleans, in New Orleans is all public charter schools now. And I know that a lot of people are in the education space here, and this really, from my perspective, is not about private schools versus public versus charter, et cetera. It's more about, especially as it relates to race and even in public districts, how those districts are created and who gets to go to schools and how schools are funded. Does everybody have a chance to an equal education? How does that occur? And then what are we taught in our schools about our history? So there is no one size fits all. In New Orleans, well before Katrina hit, the public schools in New Orleans that are not run by the mayor, by the way, they're run by a separate school district and then by the state, were failing our kids. Our kids weren't learning. The school buildings that they were in were awful. And through a lot of work that a lot of people did, there were some debates about whether or not the model that existed was actually giving the kids a great opportunity. We in the city of New Orleans decided to move in a different direction. We're working on that now. There's some good evidence that the kids are graduating at much higher rates, that the achievement gap between the kids in the city and the kids outside of the city has closed, and that there are greater opportunities for the kids than before. It's not something that everybody agrees on. It is a model that's worth looking at. I'm not sure it's scalable or replicable in other places, but essentially, I think what the evidence has demonstrated is that where you have a great principal, and you have great teachers, and the principal has the authority to hire and fire, when you are thinking about having outcomes, when you're treating kids as special as they really are, giving them the tools they need, when you have some adult supervision in the child's life that's participating in the school, whether it's one parent or two, and some involvement, whether you have accountability for teachers, where you have those measures, you produce a good result. You can clearly do that in a traditional public school. You can do that in a private school, and you can do it in a public charter school. It has much more to do with actually is what's happening in the classroom and giving the kids the great opportunity and not getting stuck on, not that they're not important, but adult issues of, who's buying toilet paper from who, what the procurement policies are, labor disputes, which from time to time are very, very important, but sometimes the balance gets focused there rather than, child-centered. But much more importantly than that, if you think about narrative change and how we learn our history, schools are critically important to, obviously, this should go without saying, what kids learn. A and B, the other thing too is, and you'll see this in the much larger issue on race, that kids of color go to schools that are not adequately funded. The way we fund schools is a huge problem. The way we create school districts through reapportionment done based on gerrymandering that legislators do that is done unfairly. All of these institutional democratic reforms are the things that make it harder to actually do things at the school site. If you start off way behind at the school site because you're in a weak place, you're in a bad building, you don't have, the teachers don't have the autonomy they need, they don't have the resources they need. I mean, how much harder does it have to be for a kid to learn who's already coming from a challenged background. And so when you start talking about race and reconciliation and you want to get into the bowels of the institutional designs, this is what white people really get caught up. When you say most white people in America who respond to surveys that we're involved in with E Pluribus Unum reject the notion that there's institutional bias and institutional racism, because what they hear is an accusation that each and every one of them are being racist every day. That is not what the general charge of institutional racism is. What it is that the systems have been designed in a way, either through malintent or benign neglect, that have created disproportionate impact and inequitable outcomes for people of color. And to be honest with you, I'm happy to argue with anybody about this, but it's pretty clear that that is in fact the case. You can argue about other reasons why disparate outcomes occur, but it is hard to ignore the creation of school districts, the funding sources for them, how those funds are sustainable, what impact and what we do to invest in those things. That's number one. Number two, universities themselves and their admission policies have not been particularly great at this. And I would venture to say, and I love all the universities in America, and this is true about every business, it's true about every government. If you look at who's leading the universities, who's on the boards of trustees, who the universities are hiring, what the curriculum looks like, my guess is that you're going to find that we could do a lot better in terms of equity and diversity. And a lot of that always, flows down in terms of who's teaching, who's not teaching, what we're teaching, what the viewpoints are. Are we really liberal arts institutions, and are we really promoting diverse thought, and are we really being challenging in being academically free so that we can all have discussions or not? And I think that, as institutions, academia in partnership with business and the government could all do better in this regard.
Yeah, very well said. One question, this has obviously been implemented in other countries from South Africa to Canada. Is there a place today for a national Truth and Reconciliation Commission is this a moment where the country might be ready for such a discussion? You've talked about the discomforts that white people feel and et cetera. But do you think that we could be at a moment perhaps after this year where something like that could be constructive?
I pray so. And the answer is yeah, if not now, when? How much more do you need to see? I just say this. I would not profess to speak or try to put myself in the shoes of a person of color. As I would be reminded, you're not culturally competent to do that. But I am culturally competent to be a white man from the South. I'm good at that. And I can tell you, having lived 60 years in the city of New Orleans, which prides itself on being a multicultural Mecca. We are the birthplace of jazz, which is the most democratic music form. Wynton is most elegant about explaining the relationship between democracy and jazz. And if you haven't seen his YouTube video about it, treat yourself to it. New Orleans is the only city in America that had the flags of Spain and France fly over it, as well as the United States. And we have always been a multicultural melting pot. And I have, in my experience in my life, been blessed to understand the value of diversity. I've also been cursed to be burdened with, and Isabel Wilkerson writes about this in Caste in her last chapter, what we have lost. If you believe that a person can change the world, and I absolutely believe it, and there are myriads of examples of it, then the absence of a person must change the world too. The absence of a young kid who could have been a great astronaut or an artist or a musician or a scientist or the president of the United States. And how many people have we left behind in this country? How many have we thrown away? And it's not only their loss, it's our loss as well. So the country has to contemplate the necessity and the urgency of dealing with this now. This is nothing less than saving America, and actually just forcing ourselves to, number one, be honest about where we came from, but number two, in a much more hopeful and optimistic way, kind of getting back to what we should have been if we would have gotten it right the first time. Because the promise of America is fantastic. The idea that the founding fathers enunciated in the Declaration and in all of our founding documents, that was reiterated by Frederick Douglass, that was reiterated by James Baldwin, that was spoken to so eloquently by John Lewis, all of those individuals, which by right could have just taken a much more negative approach to life, there is a vision out there that is just so fantastic if we would just reach for it. And if after all that we've been through with George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and the history that came before them, and COVID and the economic crisis and the racial reckoning that we have right now, if we don't do it now, I don't understand when we think we would do it, A. And B, the only way that you can do it is the same way that you do everything else. You have to set something up. You have to work at it. You have to practice it. It has to be done by individuals. It has to be done in communities. It has to be done by churches, by coaches, by schools, by governments on the federal, state, and local level, by businesses, by the Federal Reserve. I mean, by the tech giants. Everybody in America should come to common purpose so that we can finally, in America, grapple with this, deal with it, commit ourselves to get through it, have reconciliation, and then as one team, one America, kind of really just take off and be the country that we know that we can be. And I just think that we're struggling with it, and it would be sad for us not to grab the moment that's in front of us, that calls out to us in such a strong and passionate and obvious way.
Amazing words. And I, for one, really hope we see you reemerge in a political sphere here somewhere. I know at one point you wanted to be an actor, but I hope you've moved on from that aspiration to continue your political trajectory, and obviously making your family proud, which has had such deep roots there. Thank you so much for today. I think we are up against our time. Sorry again for the technical difficulties, but your words were extraordinary. And thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Great to be with you.